Hi, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of Citizen Cosmos podcast. Today, I have with me Ed FitzGerald. He's the CTO at Fetch.ai. I'm sure everybody, all of our listeners, know about this project. And if you don't, you will find out some things today. But as you all know, we're going to be talking with Edward. Ed, first of all, welcome to the show. Hi, could you please introduce yourself a little bit more than just the CTO of Fetch, if it's okay?
Yeah, no worries. Glad to be on your podcast. I'm Ed, CTO at Fetch.ai. I guess I've been with the company actually a while now. Actually, I think 5 years, and actually sort of started off not as a sort of CTO. I actually worked on a sort of original ledger implementation. So I sort of feel of myself as sort of a bit of a developer at heart, and then sort of almost begrudgingly, in some sense, like sort of climbing up the sort of like a sort of greasy pole, as it sort of were. And now my remit is obviously much wider and broader for the whole of the fetch side of things. But yeah, that's where I sort of started. I mean, I can go into a bit of my sort of background if that's useful for your listeners.
Please, I would love to. I would love
Cool.
to.
So I started off actually kind of from a embedded software perspective, actually, kind of like I would say like probably my lingua franca is sort of C++ and sort of C really in that sense. And I think that that was sort of straight out of university, and I think that sort of nurtured in me this sort of love of sort of distributed systems. And I think often we don't think of these sort of embedded systems as being particularly distributed in the sort of traditional sense, but actually there's a lot of the same sort of fault tolerant sort of shenanigans that goes on that you have to sort of deal with, even if they're on the sort of same kind of like circuit board. I did that for a while, and that was learned an awful lot. I absolutely loved it. And then actually did a bit of a kind of crazy U-turn in some sense, and I did sort of video codec research for a number of years, and so I was always sort of fascinated with basically I don't like problems that I don't understand effectively. So I always like to sort of work out what's going on, and that certainly drove the time sort of the sort of switch to kind of video codec stuff. And then I guess after that, I kind of did my kind of Web3 or kind of like blockchain kind of career, switch, which is what I'm on obviously at the moment. And I sort of joined Nokia originally as a sort of blockchain engineer, and then moved on to the Fetch afterwards.
Wait, you said because I know you were working for Nokia and for Ericsson,
Mhm.
but I didn't know you did blockchain work over there. Could you talk a little bit more in detail if you can about that? Would be curious to know.
Yeah, yeah. So it was an interesting time. It was around that sort of like 2017, 2018 sort of like blockchain boom, I guess, depending on, your perspective. Is it boom one or two, but so it was around that kind of time, and sort of Nokia were basically I'm trying to understand what this sort of technology could be used for effectively, and so they were building up kind of competence effectively in teams to do that. And I was sort of part of their team here in Cambridge, and that's the reason why I moved up to Cambridge, sort of in the first place, and then sort of took on this sort of journey. So yeah, it was good fun. Like, and we were thinking of very much on the sort of enterprise kind of context, what's sort of applicable, what makes sense in the kind of wider kind of portfolio, and it was sort of good time, but. I kind of knew deep down that I wanted to go to a startup at some point. My kind of career history beforehand is obviously very, very enterprisey, and you know depends on doesn't matter what those sort of companies do. In some sense, you're always a bit of a sort of small cog in a larger machine in some sense. So I was really looking forward to an opportunity to sort of make a mark and make a difference, and sort of move the needle forward. And so yeah, when the opportunity for Fetch came up, then it was a sort of no brainer.
It's an interesting thing that you say that about being a bolt in a machine or whatever way you describe it. There are many ways to describe it. I've definitely felt that in my hotelier career, but I'm curious. Like, was working for Nokia like that? Was it something that felt soulless?
Soulless is probably a bit too strong. I think it's just like I think there's a sort of thing where decisions take much longer than you would normally do, and like in comparison in Fetch, decisions are just sort of bish bash bosh, as quickly as we can sort of make them. And I think in some sense it's sort of a frustration more than a kind of soullessness. Like, and I think it comes with good measure in some sense because you're dealing with a kind of very reputable brand, and so making the wrong decision can be in some sense more costly, than sort of making, a particularly good right one in some sense. So I think it's just the nature of the beast in some sense. But I sort of I felt like I needed a change, and that sort of prompted the change.
Let me be a little bit devil's or well cheeky, I guess. Even when you say the beast, are we referring here to the corporational world, or are we referring to Nokia itself? Or are we? I guess not, if you worked for them. But then again, I don't know the feelings. But what's the beast here?
It's the corporation world. It's a sort of like layers of decision making and sort of stakeholders and those sorts of things in almost like a kind of like a a
Mhm,
BFT like
mhm.
consensus engine in some sense, right? If you've got lots of nodes, that is going to take inherently longer than if you have sort of two or three nodes, right? And that's the sort of thing that's sort of there. I think it's very easy to be like, oh, it's sort of, and in some way, it is sort of set up how these big companies work. They do have this lot of interlocking kind of dependencies, but it is what it is.
It is definitely what it is. Yeah, we can. The beast is the decentralization god, I guess. That makes us. But I'm curious. Wait, what about the decision making in Fetch right now? I mean, Fetch is not a small organization, and surely, as the CTO of Fetch, I mean, of course, you said you worked your way, but still, I'm sure that you have more than two or one per people working there. So, how the decision process look for you these days?
Yeah, so we have like a kind of tight knit, like leadership team of about sort of three or four people, like who kind of make the sort of the big top level decisions. I guess I guess why I'm one of them at the moment now. But in terms of fetch, we're actually very kind of like horizontally sort of spread, and so we have so that decision like depth effectively is not very high, and so we, as a sort of management team, we try and keep very in sync with each other. And so, like if sort of one, if if we're not all available, someone can make a decision. Especially some of the most of the decisions can make the decisions and just sort of crack on. I would say sort of fetch putting the fetch hat on a little bit. We're actually not that worried about a kind of culture of making mistakes, from our kind of like our engineers and bits and pieces. And it's one thing I absolutely love about the culture in the sense that mistakes will happen. We absolutely don't want to have two instances of the same mistake in that sense. We don't like that. But so long as the team and like not being malicious effectively, then we can we'll adapt and sort of move on. And I think that's sort of a great thing from a kind of place to work there. And that's part of the reason I've been around for the time that I have. And it's just very empowering. I think for people on the sort of ground. It's like, okay, we made a mistake. It's in the past. Let's move forward. Let's correct it and kind of crack on. Really.
I understand that. I guess the reason I'm asking in the direction I guess I'm digging it is I speak to a lot of validator teams, especially like and big ones. Like we're talking validators that are worth in terms of the money secured with them more than a lot of projects out there, and it's astonishing, right? But I'm curious that a lot of them are trying to develop, and we're a small validator, of course, but we also trying to make those steps into developing some distributed, not decentralized, of course, but distributed governance internal architectures. And I'm curious whether Fetch has anything like that, or it's more currently the company itself is more hierarchical these days still.
It's still hierarchical. I mean, I guess you got to look from us from a perspective where we started is that we basically, I mean, we've gone through a kind of radical change actually in some sense because we started basically everyone who was in the company was let's say not everyone but maybe sort of 95% of people were Cambridge based, and we had an office and we were sort of a regular kind of like team in that sense. And then the pandemic hit, and then we sort of like forced absolutely to kind of go into a very much remote first mindset. Now we're kind of like, I don't know what the numbers would be, but sort of like maybe 60-40 or even sort of 50-50 in some sense. So that's sort of great. And when the kind of remote first and decision making bits and pieces, we try and do our best, but probably we haven't done as much as we should do in that regard in some sense. And yeah.
I wasn't like digging in terms of you have to do it. I was curious as how it's done. This is what we always like try to understand, I guess. Let me ask you like the following question here, still on the chit chat side. You mentioned
Mm-mm-mm.
the C++ and you mentioned the first or the second boom. I guess we could go further and say the boom of 2014, 2011, blah blah blah. But what originally attracted you to cryptocurrencies? Was there a specific boom? Because I know C++ does open certain direction, of course, being most of the native coins written on C++. But what attracted you to this industry?
It was actually less to do with the kind of like the particular boom that was going on, and more, I guess, anchored in this sort of distributed system problem. I was aware of kind of the complexities and how interesting those problems are. I thought, proof of work from that sense was like, really cool. Like, and I think in some sense it's still the most elegant solution in some sense for all of for that kind of problem. And I think the other thing is that both in Fetch and in Nokia, like we were, putting together some sort of low level ledger technology, and anybody who's been a kind of like ledger developer knows that you basically touch the entire breadth of kind of computer science, storage, networking, kind of distributed systems. I mean, they're all basically the kind of hard problems there. And so I've always been actively seeking those kind of hard problems. I like to sort of, stretch myself effectively. Like,
I think that hard problems are a bit like darkness and light, right? If there was no problems, there'll be no solutions to them, right? But it's true. It's true.
yeah.
Curiosity is what leads us to be the humanity we are today. Let me ask you, like slowly. It's a question I didn't plan to ask. Again, I think, but since you're saying the word ledger, of course, you are referring to to a collection of a particular account type or anything like that. But since we are recording today, and it's the 17th of May for our listeners, whenever this podcast, of course, comes out. And of course, the word ledger springs to mind now, other things as well. What do you think about all the story with Ledger and the recovery? I don't know what to call it, the recovery option, let's call it like that. What's your opinion, personal?
Oh, yeah, it's a bit of a fiasco, I think, like all of that side of things. I mean, like, from their kind of like their first hack. I mean, I was affected. I still get now kind of like cold called and stuff like that on all that stuff now. So it's a sort of like, yeah, a bit of a fiasco, I think, and I think that's probably the summary there. But you'd be madness not to have some kind of hardware wallet, right? Like this is the problem. It's the nature of the beast. And I remember when I pretty much bought all of mine from Ledger, from the sort of paranoia side of things of, can't get it from Amazon or anything like that. Must get it straight from the horse's mouth, so to speak. But yeah.
You may both, so it's okay. It's good. It's not You're not the only one with the paranoia. I can assure you of that for sure.
Well, I mean, this industry does it to you, right? Like, I mean, in some sense, that's the greatest thing and the greatest weakness, right? Like the kind of like self control of your identity, right? That's the sort of holy grail and the most painful thing.
I'm sighing and then sighing even more here because yeah, I don't even want to go down that rabbit hole. It's it's a big rabbit hole. It's a big rabbit hole. Oh, we can talk about it for sure. But yeah, definitely that industry. I mean, the one of the latest thing that the Cosmos listeners can relate to, when not just Cosmos listeners, because we are not just in the Cosmos ecosystem, but for sure is definitely the Luna stuff, and of course. But here's another question: what do you think in general about open source and closed source code? And do you think that open source is the way forward, or does closed source have its own places where it can fit perfectly?
Yeah, I mean, it's a trade-off, like on that stuff. In general, I think I lean to more open source, the better. In general, uh, there are obvious sort of things where that kind of falls short, especially when you're doing like security updates, kind of like software, and you have to kind of close source some solutions, and you're kind of attaching kind of stuff you do. Yeah, I mean, in general, I think we're moving more and more in that way. Anyway, I think it's interesting, and I'm sure we'll get onto sort of this topic later on about kind of LLMs. But there's kind of a nice analogy there with the big Google, Meta, and OpenAI, and their big models, and the open source ones now kind of catching up in kind of comparable performance, which is sort of bonkers, especially because they're relatively small as compared. So I think it's a really interesting dynamic. It's always a thing with engineering. I think there's no black and white. There's only just shades of grey, and I think that's the sort of thing that I don't know. Maybe you start off in, or certainly I think I did. It's like, oh, there must be one true answer. But I think as you go further on in your kind of career, it's like, no, no, no. It's just particular trade offs you need in the scenario, in the particular time that you're working with.
I absolutely agree. And sorry, I'm gonna make the joke for anyone that didn't read Fifty Shades of Grey. You just heard a very quick, which is pretty accurate, to be honest, if you ask me. So
I didn't think we'd go there, but I guess it's.
um, no, no, to be the woo. So
Yeah.
on a serious note, Ed, a question. I kind of wrote this, and I don't know like how to phrase it. It's a question I was trying to write my thinking like cycle of things to ask a person with your career experience before we get to AI. And here's the thing: I'm gonna try to word it in somehow. Well, I hope it makes sense. Can we talk a little bit about somebody who worked for Ericsson and for Nokia? Now, Nokia and Ericsson are on the mobile phone world, of course, are used to be. I'm also from the 80s, so I remember very well Nokia and Ericsson as well, of course. And Nokia tried to make a revival. And actually, talking about privacy, I had a BlackBerry phone until recent, like only 2 years ago. Yeah, it was the key, the one with it was a keyboard and a screen. So still though, I'm curious, what is your opinion on the cycle of corporations when we're talking about like the life and death, and it's closely relates with blockchains and the recent hype of AI as well, I think. I don't know if I'm making any sense, but I'm trying. Help me out.
In the sense that they sort of like there's a sort of like managed decline that you sort of like see over time, or there's just a sort of a boom and sort of like yeah.
Well, the way you understand it, I would like you to try to like. I'm curious of whether you think that companies like that, for example, do they have a chance for second life when it's a big product like that? For example, with Nokia or Ericsson, or does decentralized AI, for example, which had its first hype in 2017, does it still have a chance to survival today? Like those kind of like cycles of corporations. I guess this is what I'm getting at.
Maybe, but I think it's like a sort of 10 or 15% chance. I think it's sort of one of those sort of things where it's probably better to characterize it like it's unlikely that say the sort of Nokia, for example, it's unlikely that they will have another sort of mobile boom hike that they had in the same length, say to the same degree. But equally so, I don't really see them going away that often. In any time sort of soon, in a sense. And if there is a decline, it's an incredibly kind of slow one in some sense. And from my side, actually, I was much more working from probably the side of both Ericsson actually and Nokia. I was actually much more closely working on the kind of network side of things, which is the bit that you don't actually, most people don't, maybe don't associate with both of those companies actually, and that's the sort of breadwinning sort of part of each of those kind of organisations. That's sort of a bread and butter that just keeps everything else kind of ticking. I mean, all of those companies are, I think, always searching for another kind of mobile phone kind of like high point again. And I think they're kind of one of the recent things with like the Nokia being specifically is they kind of bought Withings, which is a sort of French sort of IoT device, kind of like startup, and tried to sort of integrate it into their kind of like their wider portfolio. Sort of around the time that I was sort of with them there, uh, and so they never quite recreate the sort of same thing. Going on the sort of decentralized AI, like I think probably is quite similar in some sense. In that, like the hype cycle is always a bit of a peak, and then you kind of sort of dissolve down into sort of the core benefits of these sort of bits of technology, and they end up being maybe not as glamorous as was previously kind of like suggested, but like still very very useful.
I guess as well, what springs to mind now when you answering is whether or not do you think that distributed technologies have a longer life cycle. There is a sentence I heard. I don't remember who said that. I don't remember whose quote it was, but there was somebody trying to compare, like Web 2 to Web 3, and one of the things they did, they were like, look, one of the main differences is that these technologies might live for 1,000 years, and we as humans have not yet seen anything like that. And what do you think about this?
Yeah, I think on the kind of like the blockchain side of things, I think it is a pretty interesting paradigm that we haven't seen. We don't know the kind of implications, and I don't really see a good Web 2 alternative that isn't got some major kind of drawbacks. I think it's I mean, look at the landscape of the kind of Web 3 world, but like fundamentally, a kind of a shared, open database that everyone agrees on, like, is a powerful, powerful kind of concept, and certainly, all the kind of normal ways of building trust and transparency. And I think my side is like, again, it's a tool in the sort of arsenal, and maybe there's definitely many examples of when sort of like overused or used for sort of like that sake, but it's a very very powerful bit of technology in the same way as all the open sourcing stuff that we've had the kind of boom on, and I don't think that's going away in the sort of same way, and neither will these sort of decentralized technologies. I think we'll just get smarter about how we use them, and and sort of like pay the cost. I mean, it's obviously costs a lot of money to in some sense to have all the kind of replication and the kind of fault tolerance that you have on every level, kind of consensus or storage or whatever kind of axis that you kind of have. And there's a kind of question about when does that make sense for a kind of particular problem you're kind of solving, and when it
When
doesn't.
doesn't it?
And yeah, so I think definitely going to stay away. I think when there's no need to sort of garner sort of trust, like in that sense, I mean, you're doing it for just simplicity sort of sake. I think also a lot of the stuff that I think the sort of state explosion problems that we kind of have in kind of chain are kind of symptoms a little bit of that in some sense. And I'm buoyed by the kind of like the kind of sort of switch to more kind of roll up based techniques and stuff like that. Kind of they have their problems as well, obviously, but kind of moving to the sort of like keeping the kind of blockchain to kind of most essential information makes a lot of sense.
And do you think that the consensus, in your opinion, of course, consensus algorithms that blockchain technology uses of today are efficient enough to work?
I think there's always a trade-off between like efficiency and kind of maintainability effectively, and the efficiency obviously has multiple different kind of angle axes as well, right? As I said, I think proof of work. I think most of your listeners will probably sort of somewhat agree, and is a beautiful, elegant solution. But like the sort of you can just look at the Bitcoin network as to like how that can go wrong and maybe not lead to the same level of decentralization, the same type of like parameters of decentralization that you're kind of after. I mean, conversely, the other end of the cake is sort of like, I mean, like the PBFT algorithms that power a lot of the kind of Cosmos based chains. They're very, I mean, very old tech in comparison. About explicit message passing and kind of verification. So yeah, the sort of like trade offs in those sense, and yeah.
But you worked with networking a lot, right? What would be? I mean, and of course, consensus is not exactly the same as networking, but it's very similar when we're talking about blockchain. There's a lot of overlapping. Again, taking the fetch hat off right now. Can you give me an example of at least a paper that you've seen that aroused curiosity in that direction with you? Something that you were like, oh, this could make a difference.
I liked the idea of the original Stellar paper actually, like
Everybody did.
on this. Yeah, yeah, and I, actually at my time in Nokia, I had a go at basically, implementing it effectively, the two kind of consensus algorithms. I think that was kind of interesting and novel on that side of things, but from a kind of like a developer hat on, in some sense, it was actually kind of very complicated to implement and to get working right and reliably in that sense. And so like I think this is what I mean about the kind of like the trade-off. I mean, just look at kind of like Raft versus Paxos, right? Like the kind of Paxos original implementation was absolute a nightmare to kind of work with, and then you kind of have Raft coming out to this side of things. So especially on these sort of critical safety systems, and obviously you have to take into consideration number of nodes and validators and other bits and pieces obviously inside that side of thing. um, but that's the sort of trade-off you're always making, like between what's the typical, what are you trying to achieve.
I think there was a curious conversation you would have enjoyed, definitely even participating in. We had, sorry to pull the quill, but it's really to carry on the thought. Like we had two episodes, I believe, with the core team development team of Dash, and now their implementation of consensus is similar but very different, and it's interesting. I think it would have you would have had a lot to contribute to that. I think whether from which side is a different question, but I'm pretty sure. I'm pretty sure. Um,
Yeah.
let's go to AI. I mean, this is no, I'm joking. This is not why we gathered here, of course, but let's go to AI. 50 Shades of AI. Um, let's be very. I like taking things really down sometimes, and considering. I'm sorry, I'm going to call you like I don't like the word expert, but I will call you an expert. You are, in my opinion, you are very knowledgeable, and you have a lot of experience working in that direction. Um, can you please, as an expert, and this is important, L5 the difference between AI and decentralized AI? Like really L5, really a 7-year-old kid. I'm a 7-year-old child, and I want to understand what is the difference between AI because I already understand what it is, or maybe I'm 10, I don't know. And what is the difference to centralized AI?
Well, maybe this is a thing that I'm not so much of an expert in some sense. I'm not actually kind of an ML person by training. Actually, distributed systems is sort of more of my gig actually on that side of things. I mean, I think on the sort of super high level, I guess, and I guess by decentralized AI, you're kind of talking about these sort of protocols for like sharing, and maybe we can actually talk about a bit about kind of like Fetch's sort of protocol in some sense on this level, but yeah, I mean, like decentralized AI are trying to solve the sort of problem effectively, like of not having to have this sort of centralization of either compute or data or other sort of other kind of factor that's required for training of your models and having your intelligence. So, like the sort of traditional kind of starting point, obviously, is that more data, more compute, better model, better outcomes, on that sort of things. So you, when you're trying to do with sort of decentralized AI kind of techniques and like co-learn, which is the Fetch one is one of those, you're trying to address some of those sort of problems, and they come with kind of like some levels of trade-off. So if you take um, uh, the kind of co-learn example, what we're really trying to do there is tackle the kind of data problem actually more than the kind of compute side of things, which is like how do I make a better model with a whole load of people together that I wouldn't be able to make on my own. I mean, so it comes with a trade-off in that the model is sort of inherently shared when you do this sort of kind of protocol, and but that has a lot of benefits in a number of different use cases. And one of the ones that we featured, I think it was a few years ago, I think, but it was the sort of like the COVID kind of X-ray set, and getting kind of hospitals together to kind of like work together. And that's a really clear example where the model can be shared because you're kind of trying to solve an actual problem, like that's affecting people's like health, but for various reasons you can't share and pool all of that data in a kind of into a central place effectively. So that's what I would say. It's like you're trying to break down this sort of problem of sort of centralization effectively across a couple of axes.
So if I was to break it down for a kid, I would say imagine that your toys are not owned anymore by you, but by the whole playground.
Yeah, like difficult to maybe draw a line from the sort of like training and the data and the bits and pieces, but no, I think that's a fair thing for a 5 or 10 year old.
And I guess the benefit would here be then that it's not only your toys that owned by everybody. Now you own everybody else's toys as well, right? I guess that would be the benefit here.
Yes, depending on the kind of like the protocol, yes and no, like in some sense. But yes, like there's a sort of a shared ownership of at least one element
Okay.
generally. Yeah.
Okay.
Like yeah.
Okay. I like it.
I mean you get into interesting things with the kind of like the sort of shared model and predicting other people's data from that, and there's a sort of like partial leak of information, but yes, that's not really relevant in the sort of 10-year-old definition.
It's good to break it down. This is what we'll get to that. I have one uncomfortable question for you, and
Mm.
it is uncomfortable. Um, there was now an opinion, and I've heard it a couple of times, and I want to ask you, why do you think that opinion existed, and what is the difference now? Because I think there is, at least in my personal opinion. Back a few years ago, this was 3 to 4 years ago, I believe, maybe three and a half. A lot of people, when people were talking about Fetch, and Fetch was talking about AI, a lot of people were saying, "Oh, Fetch is just a marketplace." Why were people saying that, in your opinion? And how? What is the difference? Where is Fetch now? What is the product that Fetch is trying to deliver today?
I think we've gone through quite a few sort of like cycles internally. Like broadly speaking, in Fetch, I would say there's two main ones. I mean, we started off sort of like 2018, much more sort of heavily on the kind of research side of things, and now we're much more switching into a kind of like a product focus sort of things, and that's had changes sort of across sort of everything, almost every dimension actually of the organization. So, to do with staff, kind of like roadmaps, strategic directions, and the kind of information and content that we kind of put out on that sense. So like I think the problem always with Fetch has been that the vision is always huge, and actually breaking that down into sort of pieces and giving that to people is always difficult, like in that sense. And so people tend, there's actually, we sort of see this in sort of like the stats and stuff. We see people that basically coalesce onto the sort of aspect that they are particularly interested to or have an affinity to, and we end up having kind of clusters of kind of community rather than sort of like one but big cohesive kind of like community. I think that's starting to change, and we're moving into that direction. And I think the biggest advantage that we have at the moment, moving to this sort of product focus, is people can sort of feel and touch kind of like the technology. And maybe beforehand it was a little bit more abstract, or it was a barrier of entry because it was sort of hidden behind our kind of developer tooling, or a number of these sort of like reasons. But yes, like we're absolutely heading in a much more product focused and, in my opinion, much better direction.
Do you currently how do you currently view, I mean, because all of them, I mean, as far as I know, there is only one other AI project in the Cosmos ecosystem. But I'm curious, how do you view you personally again? And I mean, you could answer from your
Mm,
personal side, you could answer
mm.
from the Fetch side. How do you view the other, not just in the Cosmos ecosystem, but outside of it, the other AI projects? Do you view them as competitors? Do you view them as somebody you can work with? Do you agree with what they do? Do you think they're crazy?
Like a bit of both, I think, on all of the sort of bit of fronts in some sense. So yeah, there's obviously ones that are more competitors than not on that sort of thing. I think
Like,
the sort of Valerie team, I think, is kind of an interesting one with the kind of agents on that side of things. And Singularity is obviously one that we get compared to quite a lot. And so yeah, like a notion obviously for the sort of data side of things. I would say, like, while we are certainly kind of an AI focus as a sort of project, our big central kind of theme that runs through everything is the sort of autonomy, the sort of agent that we kind of build. And like those kind of the AI in some sense is a really nice sort of like additional benefit that you can kind of do. If you look at kind of co-learn, for example, that is basically an agent problem where you're sharing data and you're building a model together. It is the sort of AI kind of parts around it, but mostly Fetch is all about kind of that connectivity of the different kind of autonomous services. And this sort of leads into the wider Fetch vision, which is that we're not going to be in this world where we have to kind of pull information from the internet, not for much longer. Like, it's going to be a push. The model is going to, well, we believe it's going to be completely upended. And I think we're stuck. I think people are starting to sort of really see this, especially with things like the Google Bards and the sort of Chat GPT side of things, and the kind of the that kind of power that comes from there. And effectively, the bit that really nicely works with is obviously, if you imagine this world where you've got all of this power and automation that's executing on your behalf. The problem has always been, how do I basically share my intent, with my bit of automation, my agent, my sort of smart API, whatever kind of analogy you'd like to call it. And I think, especially with these large language models, that is becoming like easier, and there's a sort of pathway, a technology pathway to do that really, really nicely and efficiently. That isn't, you know, some kind of more elaborate, effectively kind of rules based system. Like effectively, it can be really nice in general. So yeah.
before we get to the LLMs or architecture of the agents, because I definitely want to talk about that, I must ask another slightly technological, slightly philosophical question.
Love them.
um, Now I'm gonna be devil's advocate completely because I also worked with AI, and I am a huge geek when it comes to those things. So this is gonna be a complete devil's advocate question, but I want to know your opinion. I don't know if you heard of a guy called Yuval Harari. He's a public speaker, he's a PhD guy in biology and data science and whatnot, and he's advisor of, what's his name, the guy, Schnapp, what's his name, the guy from the European financial, not financial, but
I'm pretty sure I know who you mean. Yeah, yeah, yeah,
okay.
yeah,
Thank you, because I got lost a
yeah.
little bit. He he had a very interesting, and I must say, because I'm a geek, I love to read him even more because I disagree so much with a lot of what he says.
Mm-mm.
Um, but he had a very interesting, very powerful quote sentence. I'm not going to be able to quote it right now, but today it's became, well, in the past, like since ChatGPT came out, I guess it became super relevant. Um, he said that, in the past, we never seen an adversary, whether it was a government, whether it was the Nazis, or I don't know, the Soviet Union or Pol Pot or any other evil government, or a company that had enough computational power and data to process what we can process today. And of course, with those agents and LLMs and everything else, this changes, well, amplifies the game, not changes, but amplifies it. We already expected
mm,
that.
mm.
What's your opinion? Can that lead us to potentially to the Skynet scenario? Can we all die in the next half a year?
My feeling is it's unlikely. Maybe not unlikely is the wrong word. I don't foresee a kind of a
It's a good start.
Skynet. Yeah, I don't see a sort of Skynet in the sense of one huge, great, kind of Uber AI like it in some sense. And if that did get out of control, then it would require an awful lot of compute, and so that basically the kind of physical kind of constraints of it would be kind of problematic. What I actually see is this is why I think the open source LLM side of things is really interesting is I see a much more widespread, applicability of kind of like these sort of models. So I think will it'll sort of touch sort of things much wider. Probably the models will be less sophisticated, certainly in the sort of like short term. And I think it's like certainly at the moment with what we have at the moment, the sort of like the sort of AGI spark or the Skynet bit seems like an awful long like way away on that side of things. I mean, it's certainly not. I mean, like we shouldn't underestimate the kind of like the effects of kind of like AI and on the sort of wider society. I think on that side of things, I'm not sure. I'm not sure I have a particular opinion about like the best way to kind of solve that. There's obviously lots of talk about regulation and these sort of bits and pieces. I think there's some very fairly obvious practical issues on that kind of line. So it's certainly going to be an interesting couple of years, I think I would say, in some sense. And I think we will probably make a few mistakes as a sort of like along the way, and we all sort of as we always do as a sort of human race in some sense, and we will sort of correct from that perspective. But I think that this is definitely a sort of turning point in some sense, or at least a starting of a sort of a turning point. And I mean, hopefully, there's a kind of utopian vision actually where we can end up and steer this in a way that is sort of a bit more the AI is sort of helping us being kind of super productive, and that's what we should sort of strive for. But we need to be very careful about the sort of unforeseen consequences. I think would be very difficult to predict.
I think I'm not sure if all the listeners heard it or will hear it after the editing, of course. But the irony of the ice cream spooky music started to play
Yeah,
in the
I
background
just, I
was just
just,
was
yeah.
perfect. It was just like, oh, that is good. That is good. That is very good. I love it. I love it.
the the joke for your listeners will be is it's pretty miserable out here in Cambridge at the moment. So I mean, he must be ringing that thing quite a lot to try and get people
Ah.
out. Yeah, yeah,
Mm. It's hilarious. It's hilarious. Well, it is what it is, right?
yeah.
Let's carry on. No, it was just hilarious, seeing I got a little bit pissed off, to be honest. It was what's his name? The founder, I keep forgetting his name, and actually we'll get a chance to talk one of their reps hopefully soon.
Mm-mm.
The founder of ChatGPT, and
Sam
standing in,
Ullman.
that's it, Sam Altman, because
Yeah,
in standing in court and saying, now we need to not develop AI anymore. Of course, you don't want to develop any of the competition anymore now. Of course, man. This was really making me pissed off. I'm sorry.
probably some sort of like tactical, like don't regulate me. I think a little bit like
Hmm.
there. I think that's part of it. And I think I don't know. Listening to a lot of stuff that he said, I think he's very clear that there's some serious knock-on implications like on this sort of stuff. But yeah, I just don't know. I mean, there's a lot of talk of this sort of international atomic agency kind of style regulation. I don't see that how that would work in sort of practice. But we'll see.
It's just to me, they knew about those. They understood those implications. They're very smart people, and I think we all understood what was happening, what we're doing. To kind of stand up after you release already. And I'm sorry again to pull the quilt. It makes me like, oh man, come on, like, no.
Mm, mm, mm.
Just be fair with everybody. If you did it, let everybody else do it. Anyways, LLMs and the architecture of how the agents are shaped in Fetch. I want to talk a little bit about that. Could you please tell our listeners what are those? What are the agents, and how do they work?
Yeah, yeah, I'd love to. So, an agent is sort of like a piece of automation. That's the way I describe it. Practically, what does that look like? That looks like a very similar to like a any other kind of REST endpoint that you can have. So, what Fetch does is that we build the sort of framework and tools for these sort of agents to kind of interconnect with each other, and they are kind of registered on the kind of Fetch blockchain. So Fetch blockchain is effectively this sort of discovery hub of all of these sort of agents, and these agents can sort of publish their kind of protocols and specs effectively, so that other agents can like discover them and know how to kind of communicate with them. And then I guess you've probably seen, but like we've released a number of products in sort of end of March, April kind of time, sort of agent verse, which maybe you've come across. These are all tools that are meant to help out with this sort of framework. So one of the big things that's there is we have a kind of hosted runtime for these agents. So within sort of 4 or 5 clicks or something, you can kind of deploy one of these sort of smart agents. On your behalf. You can kind of have a mini kind of Python code editor inside the kind of window. That's a sort of starting process of where we want to go. So, Fetch is the sort of infrastructure of these sort of smart automations, allowing them to kind of interconnect with each other and doing really cool things. And sort of going on the kind of LLM side, one of the things we also released with a sort of April release is sort of integration of the LLM into our Fetch wallet. So you can get it to do things like auto restaking if you're kind of like your stake on the kind of Fetch network, for example. And yeah, this is sort of our beginning experiments. We're doing an awful lot of stuff in the background about kind of transferring your intent as a person into this sort of automation, and you're going to see a lot more in that area in the next couple of months, which is super exciting.
So today, anyone can launch an agent already, right?
Yeah. So there's two main ways to do it. So you can go onto this agent verse, so it's like a hosted runtime there, and you can do whatever you want there. Or you can go and we have a sort of micro agents runtime, which is available on Python package manager. So sort of pip install micro agents or U agents if you're searching for it, the sort of micro symbol, and yeah, you can get kind of started. It's all open source. You can have a look at it, how it kind of works.
And what are you mentioned that are cool things that have been done and that you can do and that you're planning to do? Could you talk a little bit of the ones that you're excited about, or actually for our listeners, because we have techie listeners who will go and do that for sure. What are you looking for? What kind of agents are you personally expecting people to launch and to do what?
Yeah, so I can talk a little bit of the kind of direction we're heading in the sense that one of the big problems with like sort of agents in some sense is how you compose and connect them all together. And actually, LLMs actually come in and they do a really nice job of doing the kind of like task separation and building all these sort of bits and pieces out. So in terms of what we want people to sort of build for the agent verse is all things and everything in some sense, and it's relatively easy to get something like kind of like a lang chain or any of these sort of LLM kind of projects together and connect the dots in very interesting kind of ways for your agents. So, for example, to kind of make it kind of concrete, you know, if you take, say, an agent that's going to give you kind of like a hotel booking and maybe book some flights and kind of a taxi driver, it's quite easy to hook that together in the kind of LLM to say, okay, great, you want to go on holiday somewhere? I can take that objective and I can go and, okay, I need to call these sort of like 3 agents and sort of put all of that stuff together. So that's the bit that I'm most excited about, actually, kind of from the fetch side of things. And I sort of describe it as this kind of this intent transference from you to your agent that can go away and do these sort of like novel things.
Can I somehow make today, at least theoretically, let's say a baby AGI agent talk to an agent on Fetch, or am I talking bullshit right now?
No. It's absolutely right. I mean, the fundamental tenet of the kind of the sort of agent verse that we have is fundamentally introspectable. So yes, you can, and this is sort of what I was sort of alluding to in some sense, right? Like that, you have all this web of different connections. It's completely introspectable, by you or your agent, and then it can decide what kind of capabilities it might want to use on that side of things, which is I mean, in some sense, you can do some of this already with kind of like LangChain and the tools for like Google searching and stuff like that. But there's much more power, like when you have these sort of systems together, like, and they're kind of all incorporated. And the big fetch vision is, I mean, I'm not sure if you're familiar with this sort of this software pattern of sort of microservices. But the big idea with the kind of the agents is that they can compose themselves into a big microservices mesh that's really owned and operated by a whole series of different kind of people.
It's cool.
And uh, and you get this sort of really kind of nice like fundamental power from that kind of like inherent like hierarchy of abstractions.
That's amazing because I think that hierarchy of abstractions talking to each other would be the coolest thing I'm expecting to see in the next half a year or so. All those models starting to interact with each other and starting to. Where is the ice cream music man?
Hopefully he's gone, right?
He's, oh my god! Whew. But I'm really looking forward to the time. I don't know why. I get goosebumps when we talk about it. Like you cannot see it, but I really get goosebumps when we talk about different models interacting with each other from different places. I think it's going to be a mind blowing, really.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. I think it's gonna you can super move things forward, and this is why I think that this going back to LMs a little bit, like we've seen all the bits and pieces about how we there's going to be a kind of a commodification in some sense, right? Because like even if you have a really good model and they are kind of communicating via each other, you're gonna the bad models will get better really kind of quickly, and you'll get to a kind of a nice a kind of a nice even level playing field, which would be really cool. Yeah.
Guys, for the listeners, of course, I mean, please check out the links under the description of this episode, and you will follow that, play with it. This is, I think, the more people join the movement, playing with AI, the more exciting it's going to get. So, yeah.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah.
So one last question before I get to the blitz. One, it's going to be a little bit again tricky. So,
Okay.
and again, like I say, you already understood by now that I am a geek when it comes to AI. I do say that, and I get excited when people talk about that. I use it in everyday life. And the thing is, though, I had tried to help cyber a lot. I tried, and I still try. And let's just say that it's not easy. Today it's becoming easier, but when I was 3 or 4 years ago, talking and saying that there will be a personal AI assistant helping you to do things. Oh, look, are you stupid, man? Like, what are you talking about?
Mm-mm.
So the question is this: as somebody who works for an AI project, do you think that ChatGPT, Baby GPT, Bing, I don't know, Bard, whatever, have they killed any hope of decentralized AI actually making it in the market? Because the UX they have is, of course, well, I mean, again, this is a devil's advocate question, but I want to know your opinion. What is the chance to fight here back? How do we fight back? All the big corps.
So yeah, sorry. Can you repeat the question? I think we might have got a little bit more. Yeah.
Yes, 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 yes. Sorry about that. So the question is this: how do all these decentralized AI projects, like such as Fetch, such as Singularity, Cyber, Cortex, whatever, how do they compete with Bard, with ChatGPT, with Baby AGI, whatever? Because today it seems that there is no way to compete. Do you think they can compete, and how?
Yes, I think there's definitely kind of like room to compete on that side, and you're sort of starting to see this already. And so I don't know if maybe you and your listeners have seen the kind of I don't know if it is the leaked kind of like paper from Google. I don't know. Did you see this on the sort of the LLMs? And there, there's a you know the open source community effectively moving at such a pace, and the summary of the paper is effectively Google has no moat and, sort of will never will because you can't keep up with the sort of pace of kind of moving forward. And I think that's the kind of niche that is very difficult for big companies to kind of like work out. And that's the power of the kind of this decentralization of that. And so this sort of leads into my sort of I think my earlier answer is that I think that, you know, maybe there will not be, or maybe it'd be more barriers to kind of get to a larger kind of like more general model in some sense, and that will be the kind of purview mostly of the kind of bigger organizations. But I don't actually think that matters too much in some sense because I foresee this sort of lots of small kind of specific kind of models put together in the kind of open source community that can be combined and put together in a kind of like additive kind of way. So um the exact trade-off between those two, I mean, I guess time will tell. But I think the pace of innovation in the sort of decentralized or the open source way is staggering, and it will always basically beat out the kind of big corporates in that sense. So I don't think it's sort of a solved problem, and they're always going to win. And again, in that sense, I don't think we're going to have this sort of super intelligence. Really, I don't think we're going to have a Google Bard or a Chat GPT that we're just going to do everything to. I think certainly we're moving in the direction of going to a kind of like more appless kind of interface for how we work with stuff. can see like common UIs and stuff coming around the corner, like on that side of things. There's obviously challenges with the sort of chat interface in that sense. Like I'm not sure that's the perfect solution there, but we're heading in that kind of direction. But I don't really foresee one big model to rule them all in that sense. It's going to be far more federated.
When you said that, I'm already thinking that now we do it with debates every couple of months, with big, like with all the projects together, and now we need to do an AI debate, the centralized AI debate for sure. This is now 100%, because I can see that the difference of opinions and different projects is going to be fascinating. But sorry, back to you, and thank you by the way for that answer, because I loved it. Back to you though, back to the blitz, last kind of thing, 3 questions. Feel free to choose them.
Okay.
You don't have to answer quickly like a blitz. I call it a blitz, but it's not really a blitz.
Okay, quick fire round. I love it.
Yeah, quick fire round. Yeah.
Do I get a 50-50 or a phone a friend? That's the question.
It's easy. Believe me. Believe me. It's easy.
Okay,
Believe me.
okay.
You don't need them. You get to ask ChatGPT if you want. But
Excellent, excellent.
so Ed, give me 3 projects in or outside of crypto. Doesn't matter. Could be related to AI completely, nothing to do with crypto blockchain, that technologically arouse interest in what you do.
I have to call out Langchain. That's pretty cool. Like on that side of things, there's going to be a little bit of a kind of like a theme here, probably. I'm really interested in what's going on with sort of like I'm going to say red pajama, but this sort of like general kind of like space where they're kind of making models that can be used for more kind of commercial applications. That's going to be kind of like a sort of panacea here. And then I would say the other one, which is maybe a bit kind of like left field in some sense, is the kind of like the requests Python library, actually, and going completely other end of the scale of the spectrum. And I'm a sort of a developer at heart, and I love beautiful, simple abstractions. And I think there's something that's sort of like there's a reason that has effectively led the kind of like the standard for all HTTP clients, and so I think that's the sort of the perfect example in that sense.
Nice. 2 things that keep you in life, in your daily life, that keep you motivated to not just to build fetch, but keep you motivated working on AI, LLMs, and everything else.
Yep, I guess the sort of two ones would be like the team and that I kind of work with at the moment. It's very with a lot of like-minded individuals there, and we want to kind of move the needle forward on that side of things, and that gives me an awful lot of kind of energy on that side of things. And then I guess I don't know. There's something about my personality type, I guess, that I love to bring sort of order to sort of like chaos, effectively, in some sense. I find that's a sort of common theme in when I'm working and doing less coding now, but certainly is obviously a big thing when you're kind of like coding. And so choosing the right abstractions, choosing the right solutions for the kind of like the problems, kind of think about the kind of like the longer term and seeing how that kind of evolve. I love the elegance of all of the things sort of playing together as a sort of orchestra, basically. That's yeah.
A DevOps dream.
Yeah, well, yeah, yeah,
One
yeah.
last one. Wait, no, go on, go on, go on. You were going to say something. Wait, you were going to
No,
say
no, I
something, and
think
I
you
interrupted
absolutely
you.
hit the
No.
nail on the head. I was going to say exactly right. Yeah.
One last one. It's a bit of a weird one. And this time is one. It was 3, 2, and 1. So, give me one personage, character. It could be a real persona. Could be dead or alive. It could be a cartoon character. It could be a developer. It could be a president. It doesn't matter. That inspired you in the past to do what you're doing today, and still inspires you. Not an icon, but inspiration.
That is a hard one. That is a hard one, especially to pick one. Like it feels
Ah,
like it should be kind of like
let's go with one. Centralization. At least one.
I think the sort of easy one in some sense is specifically for my kind of like Web3 journey is probably Vitalik. I think and for what he's done for, I mean, the sort of the smart contract bit. I mean, that was a. I'm sure most of your listeners were the sort of same, but like um, in many ways, it's a very easy kind of like kind of abstraction and obvious in hindsight, right? But I remember when I was sort of thinking about that, it was just sort of like a boom, okay, like that makes an awful lot of sense. Like so
Nice.
yeah, that was a light bulb moment for me.
I also get that. Sometimes I have to reread what he's written 8 times, but yeah, I think I'm not the only one, probably. So. Hope, but hope. Ed, been a huge pleasure. Thank you for answering the questions, the uncomfortable ones as well, and hopefully chat again in the future.
Thank you very much. It was lovely, lovely chatting with you.
Thanks. Bye, everybody.
This content was created by the Citizen Cosmos Validator. If you enjoyed it, please support us by delegating to Citizen Cosmos and help us to create more educational content.